I'm really excited to share some results from very recent horizon scanning that we undertook, and to think about the future threats and why prevention is really, really critical. And although I'm giving the presentation, many people have been involved, and these are just some of the people who are involved directly within the workshop and compiling information and leading groups. It really is an amazing team effort, and we all learn a huge amount from one another, but the commitment of all of these people is really fantastic. So thank you to all of them. So I think that people are very familiar by now with the stark messages, and this one particularly from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform, Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Global Assessment in 2019, which highlighted and estimated that 1 million species of plants and animals are threatened with extinction. And indeed, that number in a recent paper has been suggested to be an underestimate and is looking more likely to be 2 million species of animals and plants that are threatened with extinction. And we do know about the causes of change. We know about the direct drivers of change, such as climate change and overexploitation and land and sea use change, and pollution as well. And of course, we know that invasive species are an important, one of the top 5 drivers of change, of biodiversity loss. So just to be really clear on the definitions at the start of this presentation, non-native species are animals, plants, and other organisms that have been introduced by human activities, and that human activities is really important, from one place where they naturally occur to a new region where they wouldn't naturally occur. So this huge pool of non-native species that are moving around the world. A subset of those are the ones that cause problems, and they're termed the invasive species. And they're known to have established and spread and have negative impacts on nature, and in some cases also on people too. And I was really fortunate, and last year actually for invasive species, I spoke about the IPBES report, and this was a report, the thematic assessment report on invasive alien species, their control, and I was really delighted to be one of the co-chairs of that report, and it's been fantastic to see the impacts from it over the course of the years since it's been published. And this is one of the figures from it, and we can see that over time, in all cases, whichever particular animal or plant group that we're looking at, and we can see on the y-axis here the numbers of non-native or alien species, and time along the x-axis, and we can see in all cases the numbers are going up in all regions of the world, and that in recent decades there's been a real escalation in terms of the numbers of non-native species being introduced around the world. And we also know a lot around the impacts, and through the IPBES assessment we compiled lots and lots of information on the impacts and on impacts to nature, onto nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services, and also to our good quality of life as well. And we know that some species have impacts in all of these categories, and some have a dominance of an impact in one or the other. But I always think it is a really staggering figure that 60% of global species extinctions have been caused either solely by invasive alien species or by invasive species alongside one of the other drivers. I think that's a really staggeringly high figure. We also know regarding the cost, and we know that these costs are underestimates, but that the estimated global annual cost is more than $423 billion, and the estimated cost in Britain is £2 billion, £2 billion, sorry. So we know that these species are incredibly impactful, both in terms of the economy, nature, society. And of course, there are some examples that are very well known to many of us, and we know, for example, American mink and the effects that they can have on seabirds and indeed other species as well. And rhododendron, just as a plant example, looking very beautiful in terms of the lovely purple flowers. But we know that this kind of change within the landscape isn't just a sort of aesthetic change, but is also having really quite dramatic alterations to the whole ecosystem, including as a reservoir for pathogens that affect native tree species. We've been really fortunate at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology to be working on the GB Non-native Species Information Portal since 2008 and collating information on non-native species throughout this time. And we know that there's more than 2,000 established non-native species in Britain. So these are the non-native species that are reproducing and sustaining populations within Britain. We know that the plants are dominating in terms of the numbers, 1,562 versus 542 animals. But we know that when we look at the impacts, that the animals, a much higher proportion of the animals have an impact than do the plants. But I think it's really important to remember to not downplay in any way the impacts that plants have. And those 8% of plants that are having an impact are really having quite profound adverse impacts. And this figure to the side here of the number of non-native species over time for Britain really mirrors those ones that I showed you for the whole world that came from the IPBES report, this sharp increase over time. So we are very much at the heart of the problem. We're part of the definition, the human activities that are moving species all around the world. And we know that things remain unchanged, that by 2050, we'll expect to see 1/3 more non-native species globally than we have at the moment, or that we had in 2005. So we're seeing this huge, huge increase. We also depressingly know that things aren't remaining unchanged. We know that climate change is worsening. And indeed, just as an example, invasive species interact with climate change in a whole variety of ways. So it's very concerning that all of these drivers are worsening, and we can anticipate there to be greater problems going forward. But I think it's really important to remember that we are at the heart of the solution, and that this is a problem that we really can tackle. We really can make a difference, and we really can work towards meeting global targets and national targets that Gemma's going to speak about in a while, if we work together and take action. And there's a variety of actions that we can take. Prevention, early detection, rapid response, containment and control. And we know that of those, that prevention is the most effective approach to take. So preventing the most damaging species from arriving so that they don't have a chance to arrive and to establish and have any kind of impact. We know that if prevention fails, then early detection and rapid response is another measure that can be taken. And indeed, if that fails, containment and control is still there as an option. So there are solutions, and we are at the heart of those solutions. The coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework targets 6, reducing the introduction of invasive alien species by 50% and minimising their impact, is an extremely important and aspirational goal for us to be moving towards, or target for us to be thinking about. And again, I think the world has signed up and agreed to this framework, and I think that there are many actions that we can take that will help to ensure that we do indeed meet this target. So quite some time ago, back in 2012, actually, we carried out our first horizon scanning for Britain. And at that time, we needed to have an approach that could really take into account that we had huge gaps in knowledge and understanding, and particularly when we're making predictions about which species could arrive. But we knew that this was important to inform prevention. If we could make some predictions about what species might arrive and pose a threat to biodiversity and ecosystems, then we could be more targeted in taking action either to prevent their arrival or to have early warning in place so that there could be some rapid action if they did indeed arrive. And so we developed a method that combined gathering all the available evidence that there is about species that have the potential to arrive, but then filling in some of those gaps with expert elicitation. And because we wanted to look at marine, terrestrial and freshwater systems, and we wanted to bring the expertise and the information together for species across all different taxa within these different environments, it provided an opportunity to gather groups of experts so that they would be well informed with the best available evidence, but that they could have discussions with one another so that we really could prioritise which of the species that we should be most worried about. And we trialled this method back in 2012, and it was incredibly successful in terms of people really engaged with it, and we were able to come up with a sensible and robust priority list of species that could potentially arrive within the next 10 years. And we published that first list in Global Change Biology and outlined the approach there too. We were really excited that then the approach was adopted by the EU, and we were able to carry out the same exercise for developing the list of invasive alien species likely to threaten biodiversity and ecosystems in the European Union. And indeed, this in part forms some of the evidence to underpin the EU regulation on invasive alien species. And we just have repeated the horizon scanning for Europe as well, which is very, very exciting. And then following on from that, back in 2018, with UK government funding, we were commissioned to carry out horizon scanning for all of the UK overseas territories. And that was tremendously exciting to be thinking about all of these different islands and territories around the world, to be able to come up with lists to help inform biosecurity within those overseas territories. So the method has now been tried and tested in lots of different contexts, and indeed there are many other examples that I could give of other people now using this approach. But I thought it might be just useful to talk a little bit more through how we go about it and how we take the different steps for the horizon scanning. So I've just put a step-by-step guide together. So first of all, we form some expert teams, and we have experts in teams working on freshwater animals, on vertebrates, on invertebrates, on plants, and on marine species. So those are led by different people, and they gather a small group of experts together to work with them to compile lists for example, the freshwater animals. And they gather that information from lots of different places, from databases on invasive non-native species, from publications, from the grey literature, from information from one another and from their colleagues within the global communities, to draw up a very, very long list of potential invasive species. Indeed, we looked at more than 500 potential invasive species for this very recent horizon scanning. Then the expert teams review the information that they can find, and they score each of the species for the likelihood of arrival, the likelihood of that species establishing, that is, having a reproducing population, and then the biodiversity impact. And we do have various categories for this, and we use a system, the environmental impact classification of alien taxa, for the biodiversity impacts, for instance. So though we are scoring in quite a crude way because we're looking at many, many different species, we are using kind of established guidelines to enable us to do that. And we have a score of 1, for example, if it's very unlikely to arrive, or 5 if it's very likely to arrive, and similarly for the establishment and for the biodiversity impact. And then this scoring, we do it independently as individual experts, and we pull it all together within those teams, and the different experts then come to some kind of agreement over the score that is given. But really those scores are only to allow us to rank the species. So they're just a kind of crude way to allow us to put some kind of order to this otherwise extremely long list of more than 500 species that have the potential to arrive. So we multiply the arrival established biodiversity scores, and we then get this overall total score. It's important to note that we do also record our confidence in those scores. That partly helps us to have the conversations, to be able to give a score, even though we think we just don't have very much confidence. You know, maybe we're really uncertain as to whether it could establish or not, but we're certain enough to give it a reasonably high score, but we can acknowledge that our confidence, or there might be just really limited information about that species. So we have all of these scores for all of the species, and then we can sort them and have a look, and we can combine all of the different groups, the different lists from the different groups. Then a really important part is coming together and chatting with one another. And so this is the team invertebrates from the horizon scanning from March. And we essentially just have the spreadsheet up on a long screen and we go through painstakingly species by species. It is really fascinating. We always learn a huge amount from the discussions and from the experts. And although you can see we've got a relatively small group of experts there in the room together, we are linked into various other experts who are helping us out. We might send a quick query to an ant expert, for instance. So we were sending out to an ant expert in Cyprus who was providing us with further information. So the team is bigger than it is shown here. But nevertheless, those conversations and discussions are really useful in helping us as the individual teams to pull the scores together. And we have fun. So here is Katerina Dunham-Schmitz and also Wayne Dawson, who are leading the plant team, and just dropping into the different groups discussions. You can see that the richness of the discussions that people are having, but also the fun they're having as well in talking about species that they care very deeply about and have a very, very good understanding about. So I again just say a huge thanks to all the experts who get involved and commit so much time to these exercises. So here is the team of experts that came together in New York back in March with people from the Secretariat that you'll recognise as well, Niall Moore and Olaf Boy pictured there too, and Gemma's in the photo too. It was great to have Gemma there. So they're there as observers. They don't contribute to the ranking in any way at all, but it's helpful for them to hear the conversations and discussions that are taking place. So all of the experts then come together from all of these different groups across the different environments and all of the different taxa to take a look at these long lists and all of the scores that have been put together. And from that, they're able to make some fine adjustments to the list such that we come out with a priority list. So from that 500, more than 500 species that we started out with, we decided that 145 was our kind of priority list. All of those have a reasonably high level of likelihood of arrival, establishment, and indeed impact. But then, of course, that's still a very, very long list. So we break it down into smaller chunks as well. So this is our top 20, for instance. I won't go through them all in detail, but you can see that there's a variety of different species, freshwater, terrestrial and marine species, animals, and also plants that are represented there in that list. Sometimes there are some that repeatedly come on our list. So this is the third time we've done the horizon scanning. And for example, Vespa velutina, that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a moment. And also, for example, the raccoon are species that have been on the lists in each different occasion. So just to give you a few examples, the spaghetti bryozoan was one of the species that ranks high from the marine team. And this is a filter feeding marine invertebrate. It can form extremely large colonies. It can outcompete native species, disrupt food chains, because it just can consume such a high number or large quantities of phytoplankton. But it can also block pipes as well. So we do think about not only the biodiversity and ecosystem impacts, but we also do note down any kind of human health or economic impacts that there might be as well. And this is another marine species, the Asian fanweed, Rugalopteryx. And this is a picture actually from Portugal, and I was there recently for a conference, and just the sheer extent of the seaweed along the shores and within the sea is just incredible. And it displaces native species, but also the decomposition of it on the shore can cause quite a lot of problems. This would otherwise be quite a beautiful and sandy beach that people would be enjoying from a sort of recreational perspective. And obviously the seaweed Rugalopteryx detracts from that. But perhaps more importantly is the biodiversity impacts that it has in terms of smothering other species, displacing native species. So here are some of the species that are appearing on the lists over not just this horizon scanning, but previously as well. the horizon scanning is used in lots and lots of different ways. So it can be used for prioritising species for risk assessment. And indeed, this is how the European Commission use that list. So it helps to inform which species should go forward for full risk assessment, such that if then the evidence is really supporting their inclusion within the list of invasive alien species of concern, then that evidence can go forward to begin that process. But it might also be about implementing monitoring and action, thinking about contingency planning. And we have, for example, looked at the method that Olaf Boy led on for eradication feasibility, to be thinking about some of these species around what the feasibility might be with respect to if they did become established somewhere. But importantly, it's also about enhancing biosecurity. And indeed, on the UK Overseas Territory horizon scanning that I previously mentioned, the biosecurity aspect was really important to the UK Overseas Territories, just having that forewarning of the potential of species to arrive and being able to put in place contingency planning or raise awareness for which of these species might be a problem. And I've already mentioned the yellow-legged or Asian hornet, Vespa velutina, and this species, when it was it wasn't too difficult for us to put it on the horizon scanning list back in 2012, because we already knew that it was established within France and had the potential to arrive here. And so again, with DEFRA funding, we set up an alert system. And part of that alert system is an app, the Asian Hornet Watch app, that allows people to report their potential sightings of this species. And this kind of quite kind of spaghetti looking graph in its own right has over the years the records of potential sightings that we have been receiving for this species. And you can see in the early years, it was relatively low numbers of potential sightings that were coming through. The vast majority were not confirmed to be Asian hornets. And indeed, even now, the vast majority are not confirmed to be Asian hornets. But what you can see in 2024, we had, and also in 2023, we had these huge spikes in activity of potential sightings of concern. And just for this year alone, we're already seeing, you can see the grey line there, already over the last month, the numbers of potential sightings are higher. I think this is really good news, because it means that people are really engaged and they're on the lookout and they're sending in their sightings. And that's what we want. We want people to be involved in that early warning and send in their potential sightings so that they can then be triaged, and then, which is what happens. And those are then confirmed, get sent to AFA's National Bee Unit so that there can be action on the ground. And the first record of the yellow-legged hornet was in 2016. And then every year since, there's been some records. And 2023 saw quite a leap in terms of the numbers of nests that were removed. And 24 slightly less than 2023, but nevertheless a higher number than there had been in previous years. But because this hornet, they all go back into their nest at night time. Once the nest has been found, then removal of that nest, leading to eradication of all of the hornets within it, is a relatively straightforward thing to do. This is a species that, if that action had not been taken, it could have spread across the UK. The environmental suitability of the UK is very high for the species, and it would certainly have established. And it's a species that is particularly concerned to beekeepers, but it should be particularly concerned to all of us, because it also will feed on wild pollinating insects as well. So we are really grateful to members of the public and the beekeepers and everyone who sends in their potential sightings of concern, because without those, we wouldn't know where the species is and to be able to take action. Although there is surveillance on the ground as well from the National Bee Unit with various surveys going on too, but the public are making an enormous difference, and that's really fantastic. So it's really wonderful and exciting that now we're in Invasive Species Week again, and a real opportunity for all of us to raise awareness about the threat of invasive species to biodiversity and ecosystems, and indeed to the way we live. And from the perspective of the work that I've been involved with the flow of information on species, it's really amazing to see how people get involved and how they report their sightings, not only of just Vespa velutina, but of a whole variety of other species as well. And I would say that it's really important that if you're out there and you're a taxonomic expert and you have any first records of species, we really, really want to hear about those, as well as hearing about the species that are also on our priority alert list that you can find on the Non-Native Species Secretariat website. But it's always really exciting to see the infographics that Lucy provides to show how that raising awareness is going. And I think, you know, it's not just about Invasive Species Week, it's important that we continue to talk about Bee Plant Wise, Check Clean Dry, the alerts, and getting everybody involved in taking action to deal with invasive species. Because curbing the major and growing threat from invasive alien species is achievable. It's urgent, but it is achievable. And from the IPBES report that I mentioned, all the evidence points in that direction. If we take action and we sustain that action and we have sufficient resources to do so with long-term commitment, then preventing and controlling invasive, non-native or alien species are attainable goals, and that will benefit us and also nature. I just thought I would also mention that we're doing a lot to celebrate Invasive Species Week at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And one of the aspects that we have done is put out a podcast, Counting the Earth, podcast Encounters of the Invasive Kind. So this is now available and it features the wonderful Olaf Boy as well. So I'd really encourage you to listen to our podcast. And just to say a huge thanks again to the Non-Native Species Secretariat and also to DEFRA for all of their ongoing support for the work that we're involved with, but also IPBES, Darwin Plus and the Natural Environment Research Council and my host organisations, UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and the University of Exeter. And it's lovely to speak with you all, and I look forward to hearing from Gemma and hearing your questions in a short while. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That was a brilliant talk and a great introduction to Invasive Species Week. The horizon scanning is a really important part of preventing new arrivals, so it's really great to have the new list. I will put a link in the chat box to the horizon scanning page on our website where you can find the new report and annex, so you can see that for more information. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions, but we can save those for the end. And next up, I'm very pleased to welcome Gemma Shaw from DEFRA, who is going to talk a bit more about some of the targets that we have for biodiversity and invasive species, which also helps show why prevention is so important. So I'll hand over to you, Gemma.
Thanks, Lucy. I'll just share my slides now. Hopefully they'll come up for you in a minute. Yeah, hopefully you can see those now.
Yep, that looks perfect.
Great. So yeah, hi everyone. Just as a quick introduction, I'm Gemma and I work in DEFRA's National Biodiversity Evidence and Analysis team. So within the team, one of the areas that I cover is invasive non-native species and the kind of evidence questions we need to think about for them, and in particular, the impact they have on biodiversity. So today, I'm just going to give an overview of some of the targets we have for biodiversity, and then more specifically for invasive non-native species. As Lucy said, thinking about why prevention is really important. So to start with biodiversity more generally, through the Environment Act, DEFRA set 4 legally binding national biodiversity targets, which are to halt the decline in species abundance by 2030, and then by 2042 to improve species abundance by at least 10%, to reduce the risk of species extinction to below its 2022 level, and then to restore or create 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitats, and that would be outside of protected sites. So thinking about the targets for species, we know that there are 3 very broad types of action that are needed at scale across the country. So the first is to create or restore habitats, which is covered by the target that I just mentioned on the previous slide, but doing that is really important to provide the habitats that species need. The second element, which is most relevant today, is to tackle pressures that are negatively impacting species. So that's things like water quality, pesticides, and then most relevant to today, invasive non-native species. And then the final component of delivering those biodiversity targets is taking targeted action for species. So that's where they might need more bespoke support than the kind of broader actions around habitats and pressures. So invasive non-native species will be really important for delivering these targets. As I mentioned, they're one of the key pressures that impact biodiversity and therefore the delivery of biodiversity targets. And we know that invasive species have really widespread impacts on the environment, the economy, and also on people. So Helen already went over some of this, but invasive species are one of the biggest causes of biodiversity loss worldwide, and globally they've contributed either on their own or alongside other drivers to 60% of recorded species extinctions. So they do have that really big impact. In GB specifically, there was a recent DEFRA-funded analysis looking into the impact of invasive non-native species on native species in GB. So this was completed by Helen's team in the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, along with ICF. And that analysis found evidence for direct negative impacts of invasive non-native species on at least 36% of native terrestrial and freshwater vertebrate species. So this is already a large proportion of those species, so over a third, and we do know this is also an underestimate because of limitations of some of the evidence that's available and kind of the wide range of impacts that invasive species can have. Thinking about the economy, again, Helen mentioned this already, but invasive non-native species cost nearly £2 billion per year in GB. So I think this just highlights the huge impacts they can have on the environment and economy. Thinking more specifically about the status of invasive non-native species in GB, so we know that there are currently more than 2,000 established species, and approximately 14 new non-native species are establishing in GB every year. And of these, looking at kind of the historical trends, we think that about 10 to 15% of those will become invasive and have negative impacts. And this image on this slide here just helps to visualize these numbers. So the chart shows the number of invasive non-native species that are established in or along 10% or more of GB's land or coast. And you can see that the numbers are going up across all habitats, so terrestrial, marine, and freshwater. The numbers of established species have been going up over time. So we do have some specific targets and commitments that we're working towards for invasive species. So thinking internationally, there's the Convention on Biological Diversity, Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which as a whole includes 23 targets related to biodiversity. And Target 6 specifically relates to invasive non-native species, covering the importance of identifying and managing pathways of introduction, preventing introduction and establishment, and also eradicating or controlling invasive species. Similar actions and commitments are set out in national strategies for England and GB. So DEFRA has published an environmental improvement plan that sets out how government is going to improve the environment in the UK, and this includes specific sections on invasive non-native species. There's also the GB Invasive Non-Native Species Strategy, which covers the period from 2023 to 2030, and that gives a very detailed plan for action against invasive non-native species. And both of these are published online if people would like more details of the types of kind of actions that are included in those. So as has come up quite a lot in this talk already, one component of the targets is to prevent the introduction and establishment of new species in GB. And this is a really key priority to reduce the impacts of invasive species in future, and is one of the key outcomes of the GB Invasive Non-Native Species Strategy. So prevention is a way to maximize the reduction in impacts and costs of tackling invasive species. Of the different approaches you can take, and it's known that that's the most cost-effective way to manage them and reduce the negative impacts they're having on the environment. And achieving prevention can be done through horizon scanning and contingency planning, which Helen covered in her talk, and then also by taking actions to prevent species from arriving here. So that's things like managing pathways of introduction, intercepting species before they get into the wild, and then rapid response and eradication when species do escape or start to establish. And the ability to do all of these is really dependent on effective surveillance and monitoring, and that's very dependent on the GB Non-Native Species Information Portal, which Helen covered. So focusing a bit more on the targets we have for establishment, so the international targets under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Target 6 states the targets to prevent the introduction and establishment of priority invasive alien species, and then to reduce the rates of introduction and establishment of other known or potential invasive species by 50%. So that would be the species that aren't covered by the priority component. These targets are kind of mirrored in national targets. So as I mentioned, these are set out in the Environmental Improvement Plan and GB strategy. And these both include a target to reduce the establishment of invasive non-native species by at least 50% by 2030. So I work in the evidence team in DEFRA, so I thought I'd just give, as I finish, a quick overview of some of the evidence needs for invasive species that will be really important to help to deliver these targets. So as with any other area, making policy for invasive non-native species needs to be underpinned by a really strong evidence base, and the GB Invasive Non-Native Species Evidence Strategy, which was published in 2022, sets out the priorities for invasive species research. And that includes 7 recommendations for some of the key evidence gaps, thinking about things like impacts of invasive species, both on the environment and economy, horizon scanning, understanding pathways of introduction, and then approaches for responding to or controlling invasive species over the longer term. We then have some ongoing projects within DEFRA to try and work on some of these gaps. So the first of these is to develop metrics to understand progress towards delivering the establishment targets, which is something that's quite difficult to do because it's hard to know for sure which species are arriving and what kind of timescale that's happening over. So there's 2 components to this that we're thinking about. The first is thinking about what types of actions have been delivered to prevent species from establishing. So prevention can be achieved through managing pathways of introduction, intercepting species before they escape, responding to them when they do, or eradicating them when they start to establish. And by monitoring these different types of actions, you can start to understand what types of biosecurity measures being put in place, which species they're targeting, and then think about how they might be working in practice. And this links to the second part of monitoring these targets, which is to measure outcomes for invasive species. So what we're aiming for is to produce a measure that lets you see how successful the biosecurity actions that are being taken actually are. So to do that, if you predict the number of invasive non-native species that are likely to establish and then compare that with the trends for what is actually happening, that kind of gives you a measure of how biosecurity measures are working. So again, this is a project we have with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and Helen's team is working with us to try and develop these models to be able to do this. And it's a really challenging piece of work because of some of the limitations of the data we have and the complexity of the modelling, but it's quite exciting to be moving forward in how we'll be able to monitor progress towards these types of establishment targets. And I've included a very simple image here that just shows an example of what that might look like if you have the historical data in black and you can predict into the future, which is the blue line. That's what you might expect to happen, and then assuming you have managed to put effective measures in place, the aim is to then reduce that rate of establishment shown by the red line. And just as a final slide, I just wanted to quickly mention 2 more projects that are both linked to specific evidence gaps highlighted in the evidence strategy. So the first is thinking about the impacts of invasive species on native species and habitats in GB. So I mentioned this on an earlier slide. We have had a project with UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology to try and think about the types of impacts invasive species are having and how we might be able to quantify those. So UKCEH have developed a proof of concept approach to doing that focuses on vertebrate species, and then we now have some ongoing work to produce a more comprehensive assessment thinking about the broad range of impacts invasive species can have. And a second element is thinking about understanding climate change, and in particularly how climate change might interact with invasive species and the threats that they are having towards biodiversity, and then also the invasive species that are likely to pose a greater risk due to climate change. And this is one that will be really important to link to the prevention element, because we need to know what the risks might look like in future. So we have had an intern start recently in DEFRA who's going to do an evidence synthesis on this to try and help us understand the question a bit more, linking to the gaps highlighted in the strategy and the kind of need to understand the future risks to inform prevention efforts. That's all from me. Just want to say thank you very much to Lucy for organising this webinar today, and Helen for presenting as well. It was a really interesting talk. But I'll hand back to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Gemma. That was another excellent talk. They're definitely ambitious targets, but it's great that we have them. And the metrics is very interesting as well, because it's quite hard to measure a lot of the work that we do. So it's really great that we'll have those. We have some time for questions now, and I've just seen one come into the chat box. If you do have any questions for Helen or Gemma, then type them into the chat box and we can go through those. So the first is from someone who leads a citizen science intertidal and subtidal marine project looking at marine species in local harbours. So they've been reporting non-native species through iNaturalist, as they found iRecord a bit more challenging to use. They've reported 15 species, but are waiting for peer review of those to research grade quality. So they're asking if there's any monitoring of iNaturalist to ensure that reports in the public are verified. Helen, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really excellent question. And the sort of flow of data is a really important aspect for us to be thinking about. And in terms of sort of being able to tackle these species, it's really important that we do have that flow of information. So I'd be really interested to know what it is about iRecord that may be presenting some problems. In terms of we do take a look at iNaturalist, so that's the simple answer. And particularly for the alert species that we have listed, we would be taking a look at iNaturalist, and also for terrestrial species, certainly, and probably freshwater as well, iNaturalist information, when it reaches research grade, comes into iRecord. But I can see that from this question, there's this issue over the research grade side. And so I think what I can do is we work in partnership with the Marine Biological Association on the GB Non-native Species Information Portal, and indeed Chris Wood from there, who's amazing, led on the horizon scanning for us. And I could speak to her a little bit more about information in iNaturalist. And the marine side of things is incredibly active in terms of compiling information. So you might also want to get in contact direct with the Marine Biological Association. But just to assure you, we do look for the alert species in iNaturalist.
Thank you, Helen. That's great. So another question, does the horizon scanning consider native species that could become invasive with changing climate and pressures? I think that's another one for you, Helen.
Great, no, thank you very much. Another really excellent question. So we don't. We think very specifically about the non-native species. So while we acknowledge that, of course, some of our native species may be troublesome for some people, and context is all important there, they're not trouble for other people. But no, we just consider those species that have been moved from one part of the world to another by human activities, and they are the non-native species.
Thank you, Helen. Another one for you. So you emphasise in the definition about the due to human impacts. How do species that have become invasive, for example, due to climate-driven range shifts, factor into the thinking?
That's another really excellent question. And so if a species is extending its range perhaps northwards as a consequence of climate change, but it's extending its range from its native range, those species would not be included within the work that we're doing. They would not be counted as non-native species. There are species on the move, but they're moving as a consequence of other factors. However, if a species is extending its range as a consequence of climate change from an area in which it's already invaded, they would be included. So I hope that kind of distinction makes sense, but we're not including those species that are extending their range from their native range due to climate change.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. One on yellow-legged hornet. So with the increased citizen reports in the last couple of years, do you think this is more due to increased public awareness leading to increased potential sightings, or is it actually an increase in numbers?
And of course, it could be both. I think it's been really fantastic to see the level of public awareness. And we back in 2004, actually, when we had the first record of the harlequin ladybird that people might remember at that time, it seems amazing. It's more than 20 years ago. We were really inspired by people's willingness to send in their sightings of the harlequin ladybird, and that really encouraged us that the public will get behind these monitoring and surveillance initiatives. So I think the awareness is increasing, which is really, really fantastic. And I'm absolutely sure that Invasive Species Week helps with that as well, but also all of the activities that many of you will be doing on the ground and through local action groups, for instance. It's phenomenal to think of the work that goes on in terms of people sharing information and raising awareness. The media has been amazing in picking up on the story a lot and talking a lot about it. And that's been fantastic as well in contributing to that raising awareness. But yeah, perhaps in the last few years, you know, as well, those additional nests that have been seen perhaps have increased the numbers of records as well, but still is a very, very low proportion of the overall number of sightings that we get that are actually confirmed. So I think it's more the public awareness.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. One for you, Gemma. Can you say if the invasive species abatement indicator might be considered as a statutory environmental target?
I can't, I'm afraid, primarily because, yeah, I work in the evidence team, so thinking about some of these evidence questions. So that would be one to pick up with the policy team, and I'd be happy to put people in touch if useful.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. Thank you, Gemma. One I've just missed. I think for you, Helen. So
Yeah.
what do we use for as a baseline for whether something is a non-native species? Is it just since records began? So this is from someone that's studying an area where an invasive species was introduced in 2006, which they're trying to tackle, but previous publications have shown another species only turned up in the area in the 50s, but no one is as bothered about that one. So the graph that you have, Helen, showed back to the 1500s, but could we just be having more non-native species because we didn't have records like we do now?
I think within Britain, we've been amazingly fortunate that we have this rich legacy of biological recording of people having an interest in wildlife for hundreds and hundreds of years and sending in their sightings. And, you know, particularly I think around new species, people are often very excited by those and often do share them. And we definitely encourage people to keep doing that. We want to know as soon as someone spots something, we want to know about it. So it's not a time element. It is simply that definition that if the species has been moved by humans to a region where it would not otherwise naturally occur, then it will be counted as a non-native species. And it doesn't matter whether that is in recent decades or hundreds of years ago. If the species has been moved by humans, then it would be counted as a non-native species. In terms of who cares about which species, I guess, you know, there is a variety of kind of perceptions and values, and also the evidence that we have on impacts, for instance, varies across different species. And also it's important to note that, you know, this is a very dynamic situation, and, you know, some species that maybe weren't showing kind of invasive tendencies in the past may start showing invasive tendencies. So we have to really be on the lookout for all of these different species. We know that as the climate warms, there are going to be some species that can really benefit from that warmer climate. So, for example, some insects that might not have been able to settle within Britain will in the future be able to thrive here. So we just need to keep very active in terms of looking out for what's there. But yeah, the date isn't so important. It's about whether humans were involved in the movement or not.
Yeah, I think we used the end of the last ice age as our date, which is obviously quite a long time ago.
Yes, that's a long time ago.
Okay, we've got some in the Q&A. So how do you manage the trend for rewilding, where the theory appears to be if it was once in the UK, it's a native species, but this may have had hundreds of years, even thousands of gap, and if introduced now could become a modern invasive species in the current ecological system?
Oh, that is a really, really excellent question. And, you know, I think it's really important that the different kind of communities who are working on species on the move, people working on rewilding and reintroductions, those who are looking at kind of climate change and movements, and those of us looking at biological invasions, that we all work together to sort of, as well as possible, understand what the current picture is. And I think also we can borrow frameworks from one another, such that if someone wants to introduce a species somewhere, that they go through a very, very rigorous risk assessment. And I think that in terms of the rewilding, I think that what's really important is that people kind of don't take it into their own hands and go about the rewilding, that they do go through the appropriate processes to ensure that if they are releasing, that they're following protocols, and particularly around the legislation side of things as well. So I think that's quite a waffly answer from me in terms of, if a species, of course, we have species that have that were here and that maybe went extinct. And I think perhaps an uncontroversial one would be the large blue butterfly, for instance, which was extinct and then has been through a very successful reintroduction program and is now really beginning to thrive. But that butterfly went through a lot of kind of stringent testing and looking for disease, etc., before that release happened. And I think that's what's really important. I think conservation is a really complex thing, and conservation decision making is really complex, and it's best that we're all as well informed as possible, and then we make those decisions collectively. So I feel like it is quite a hand-waving answer. But of course, yeah, we can learn a lot from one another.
No, it's good. And we've got a point in the chat, which I think backs up what you're saying, Helen. So reintroduction should follow the IUCN guidelines and be risk assessed. Another question, how can you predict whether a species that is purposefully introduced for ecological replacement will become invasive?
It is really difficult to make predictions around which species are likely to become invasive and which won't. I think often if the species has traits that will obviously make it invasive, then that's quite straightforward. So we know that, for example, if it is a very generalist predator or a really efficient filter feeder, for instance, then for sure we know it's going to alter the community of other species that it arrives with. I think where it's more difficult is some of the more sort of borderline species, for instance, and also when we think about time lags as well. So sometimes we can make predictions in quite a short time where some of the species are going to have impacts over a much longer period of time. So we might be thinking about trees, for instance, that they might have a much longer time before they become invasive. And so I think that that's really important, again, that we use all of the tools that we have and all of the knowledge that we have, and that we do follow a kind of precautionary principle around species that are being introduced for one purpose or another. Because, of course, once a species is here and once it's established, then it becomes really very expensive and difficult to do something about. But we do know some traits that make species invasive. So as I said, the obvious ones, it's quite straightforward. It's those that are more on the borderline, but we do have amazing risk assessment frameworks that we can follow.
Yeah, one which links to that actually. Is any genetic analysis involved in predicting invasions?
Absolutely, and that gives me a perfect excuse to mention fantastic colleagues of mine at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in Edinburgh, who indeed are working on kind of the genetic aspects of various, in their case, of plants. But indeed, yeah, it is an important thing for us to consider and to understand that kind of genetic variation of species, and that sometimes some of the species that we, and indeed, when you think about some species being introduced perhaps for planting in the past, maybe they were introduced for some of their traits that actually do make them invasive. So somebody might have wanted to have an amazing amount of cover in their garden, so they introduce a species that spreads very rapidly and grows very efficiently. And of course, these are sort of traits that will then lead it to be problematic.
Thank you, Helen. I'm just going to check if we have any more questions.
I could also mention that on the genetic side of things as well, it's very exciting to think about the range of emerging tools and technologies we have for detection and early warning. And indeed, there are molecular tools now as well. And environmental DNA, for instance, where someone can take a water sample and match the DNA within that water sample to a library of barcodes to see what species might be present. So yeah, the molecular side is a really important one for us for surveillance and monitoring, as well as for better understanding the kind of population genetics of species that may go on to become invasive.
Thanks, Helen. So we have another question which I might be able to answer. So this is from someone who works in the engineering sector within the railway. So their team are out and about in the countryside a lot and see a lot of species. When out on site, how can we minimise the risk of bringing invasive non-native species into these areas? Are there any little actions we can all take? What can they do if they find an invasive species on site? And are there any useful resources that they can give to their team to show what to look out for? So we have lots of resources that people can use on our website. So we have a poster with alert species, which are either new or not widely spread species that we really want people to be on the lookout for. And we have lots of ID sheets and other materials like that. If you do find something, you can report it. We recommend using iRecord as a kind of main reporting system for any non-native species, but there are lots of other systems that you can use as well. I'll put a link in the chat to the recording page on our website for those. Just checking I've covered everything in this. Oh, and then a really important thing to do is just to follow a good biosecurity routine. So making sure that if you're working in or around water or mud, that you're kind of cleaning your equipment, vehicle, that kind of thing before you move to another site to reduce your risk of spreading sort of seeds or fragments. We've got some free online training in biosecurity on our website. So I will put a link to our website in the chat, and there's lots of resources on there. You can also contact us. I'll put our email address as well if you have any more kind of questions around that. I think I've seen one more question come in, and then I think we are probably ready to close. So once an invasive species is established, is there actually hope of eradicating them, particularly in the marine ecosystem, as there is space they can escape or hide to beyond human reach?
Yeah, there's been some really excellent questions, and it'd be wonderful to just sit and chat all afternoon. But yeah, just to say, so the marine environment is particularly tricky. So prevention is so important in all environments, but particularly in the marine environment, because just as the question alludes, once a species within a marine environment, just the connectivity of that system makes it very, very difficult to take further action. But yes, in the terrestrial and freshwater systems, other actions are absolutely possible. And there's been some amazing examples of containment, control and eradication across Britain. And we just have to think about things like around the world, the eradication of rats on certain islands, and how successful that is, and how that then leads to an increase in the seabird populations. And just to end on that sort of message of hope, I think it's been really interesting to recently read how when there has been something like a rat eradication, it's not just the seabirds, for instance, that thrive. The vegetation structure on the islands can also start to really pick up. And indeed, recent studies are also showing that that has a big implication in terms of improving the marine environment as well. So this whole systems can benefit from taking action, but it doesn't detract from the fact that prevention is definitely the most important strategy.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. I think that's a good point to end on. So if anyone has any burning questions, you can contact us in the Secretariat on the address in the mailbox, and we'll try and get those answers for you. There's a link to our website as well, where you can find more information on Invasive Species Week and the other webinars that we're running this week as well. But I just want to say a huge thank you to Helen and Gemma for such brilliant talks today, for your time, and to everyone for joining, spending your lunchtime with us. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this, and yeah, thank you.